In this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism, I have Will Hall with me, who has been involved with, I consider it kind of a reform movement, activation movement, to deal with some of the issues in mental health. And where I think he and I recognize there's opportunity for reform. Now, Will is a counselor and facilitator who works with individuals, couples, families, via phone and audio, lives in California, and he has taught several mental health workshops, trauma shops, things related to psychosis, medication, violence, around the world, really. His website mentions 30 different countries, so he's been very involved in a wide spectrum of activity. Will holds a master's degree in process work from a Jungian counseling school, the Process Work Institute, and is a PhD candidate at Maastricht University, the medical center, the School for Mental Health and Neuroscience. He has lived experience, what is called lived experience, from experiences back in the 1990s, and has been able to come through those and is now an advocate for a better understanding of such experiences. He hosts the podcast Madness Radio and is the author of Outside Mental Health, The Voices and Visions of Madness, which is a collection of 60 interviews from survivors, scientists, journalists, artists, basically a broad spectrum of people sharing different elements related to mental health and, as the title indicates, madness. And he's also the author of a guide called the Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs, which we will talk a little bit more. So, Will, I want to say thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I know that you've been, you have a number of different interviews out. I've seen your work that dates back several years. So being able to speak with you is a nice opportunity. Now, hitting your website, which is willhall.net, and of course, I'll include that in the notes and such, but you call yourself a schizophrenia diagnosis survivor. What is that? And could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for noticing the careful wording on that. Schizophrenia doesn't exist, or at least not the way that we think of it. It's a term that gets thrown by psychiatry, by the medical establishment, on experiences that challenge or question or defy or conflict with what might be considered normal, ordinary, expected behavior. It's a term that comes more than 100 years old. It comes from the old asylum system where they basically rounded people up. They rounded up the poor. They rounded up people who were seen as mad or who were troublemakers, and they just put them in warehouses. They put people with dementia, with learning disabilities, people with Down syndrome, people with Alzheimer's, people with syphilis, people with brain infections. They put them all together with people that we would now say have mental illness diagnosis or are struggling with emotional distress. And there wasn't any differentiation. They just were all thrown together. And this term schizophrenia persisted. It's still a term that we use today. So when I was in psychiatric hospitals, when I was locked up, that's the diagnosis they gave me. They gave me a kind of schizophrenia called schizoaffective disorder. Now, if you look at the details about what fit into this diagnosis, there's so many different kinds of expression. There are people who talk a lot, people who don't talk a lot, people who are very withdrawn, people who are very engaged, people who make a lot of sense most of the time, but they don't make sense part of the time, people who don't make sense any of the time. There's just so much variety. People who make sense to one person but don't make sense to another person. People who are very distressed when they're around their family, but they seem so-called normal when they're not. So it's a really useless term from a descriptive or explanatory or understanding standpoint, especially when we start to realize that a lot of people get called schizophrenic when they're in fact better understood, or they better understand themselves as mystics or as shamans or as having a spiritual experience. Very quick way to understand this is that if you are so-called hearing voices, if you report that you're hearing the speech or noises or the voice of someone or something that other people don't hear, that's considered an auditory hallucination and is one of the main symptoms of schizophrenia. Although, like I said, many people who don't hear voices are also considered schizophrenic because it's just a broad bag of all these different. And we know, if you just have any kind of familiarity with the world's religious and spiritual tradition, that lots of people hear voices. In fact, it's cornerstone of prayer for a lot of people. There's the still small voice within. There's the history of prophets. There's people who find the guidance of conscience. And then when you look at poets or you look at musicians, Paul McCartney, some of the Beatles songs that we love came to him through voice hearing experiences and through dreams where he heard the music in a dream. So the idea that I'm recovering from a diagnosis of schizophrenia is the idea that the diagnosis is not something that I believe or that actually even exists or is even real, but it's the opinion of other people that was imposed on me.
Right.
And I'm in the process of recovering from that diagnosis because the diagnosis itself is extremely harmful. You don't go to a cocktail party and someone says, "Hey, what do you do?" And you say, "Hey, I'm a schizophrenic." I mean, it's not the kind of thing that builds bridges and connects people. People are scared. The associations are with violence and with disruption, and people are threatening and dangerous. So it's when I say I'm recovering from a diagnosis of schizophrenia, it's kind of a window or into my experience, and it's sort of like a starting point for a conversation, which can be kind of complicated. I think that madness, and when people do start to go into weird altered states, and they become very disruptive and very confusing, and their personality changes. I mean, this is a real thing that happens. It has happened since the beginning of humans, that people seem to go into other realities or have a break with their ordinary self, and suddenly you can't communicate with them, or they're talking in this very strange way, or they're not taking care of themselves. I mean, I want to be cautious about what words we put on that, but it is a real thing, the experience itself. So when I was in the psychiatric system, I was going through real experiences. I don't believe that mental illness is just a myth. I mean, there's something there, but the problem becomes, how do we interpret it? How do we understand it? How do we respond to it? And that's when I think the mental health system is really best seen as a disaster. I mean, it's absolutely the opposite of what we need. It's harming many people.
It's interesting because just even in your answer, what I've noticed in speaking with people, that the vocabulary and the words used, for some people have so much power and other people not so much, or, there's so much variability, not just in the experiences, but in the language used. So like for me, I don't consider what I went through an illness at all. I mean, if anything, it was, how was I affected by social illnesses as opposed to mental illness? Do you see what I mean? And,
totally.
and I kind of look at it as more of a process that a person goes through than this illness. But I just wanted to point out, because it touches on the psychiatric survivor movement, which I know you were also very involved with. Is that did that start in the 90s, or did it have a resurrection in the 90s? Or
well, the psychiatric survivor movement started the first time a psychiatrist was violent towards someone and they resisted.
There you go.
That's when it started, when someone said no and fought back. And so the movement, I mean, there are organizations, there are groups, there's associations, there's Facebook groups, there's different institutional efforts, we could say, but really the movement is something deeper than that. It's about people who identify as being victimized by the violence of psychiatry, if from physical violence to the, being assaulted, kidnapped, held down, tortured to the point of having people killed by violence, to the more emotional, psychological violence of being told that you're broken, that you have to be, fixed by these experts, to the chemical injury, the toxins that we're forced to take. Now, having said all that, I should be very careful because I want to be clear that I have a harm reduction approach. I'm not anti-medication. I'm not even really anti-psychiatry, in the sense that if someone wants to go to a psychiatrist and get support or get understanding, great. If they want to go to an astrologer and get support and understanding, if they want to go to a priest and if they want to go to a shaman, that's all. But the problem comes in when we give psychiatry, or we give anyone really the power to define us in a way that has legal consequences that are going to lead to violence and abuse and stigma, and then an incredible social impact on our identity. So I really like what you said about the variability. I always come back to that. Everyone has a different experience. That the big failure of the psychiatric system and the mental health system is it's a giant factory. It's just a conveyor belt of just putting people into categories and then sending them into different chutes of what drug are you going to take to be able to mass process people. That's fundamentally what diagnosis is. It's a way of categorizing and sorting objects in a factory. That's what it is. Instead of
excuse me,
listening deeply to each person's individuality, because when we are understood in our individuality, then we start to open up, then we start to trust, then we start to explore and try and work with experiences that are maybe scary and overwhelming. But without that trust, without that me saying, hey, I'm going to meet you for who you are. I'm not going to just put you in a category and then stop listening to you. Now, if I'm listening to you and you embrace a category, you're like, hey, this is how I understand myself, then great. But I have to hold that very lightly because it can change.
right?
There was a time when bisexuality was a term that was used. It still is used, but now a lot of people use the term queer, or they use other kinds of, or they talk about having fluid in their sexuality. And so the terms that we use have to be held very lightly and always checked back with the actual experience that the person is going through. For a while, victim, like saying I'm a victim of rape, or I'm a victim of incest, was a very empowering thing for women, for people, especially women. Now victim has a different kind of, so we say survivor,
Right.
we say, so I really want to stay very, very close to the variability of the experience that people have, because I want to get to know them and I want to connect with them instead of just dumping someone in a category.
And it's interesting because there's the variability, but then part of what you were saying is even the variability of time of how that language is used as well.
Exactly.
And I can't remember if I mentioned I have a master's in statistics, so I keep coming back to the math stuff.
Yeah.
The modeling and all of that.
A lot of the heart of the problem is our over reliance on statistical thinking and losing the individual in the aggregate.
Just before, in preparation for this, I caught the interview you had with James Moore on Mad in America, and you said you start with N=1. And I thought that was a great way to describe it. But I would say that it's statistical principles that are either ignored or misapplied.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's what frustrates me, because even talking in terms of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. Now, I hate the word disorder, but there's like no statistics in how these. So you have no idea how much it ticks me off that STEM.
Yeah, no, it ticks me off too. I'm not specialized in statistics, but I'm studying it as part of my PhD. And that you raised a really good point, because I'm very strongly pro-science. I'm very pro-science. I'm a scientist. I'm training to be a scientist. I think what we're dealing with is the misuse of science and the putting of science in the wrong place. We put science in the place of determining our values. Science has no ability to give us values at all. It's just a descriptive way of organizing observation and creating predictions. But I think that if we actually stick with the spirit of science and we stay with what science really is, then we come to the conclusion that we do have to be focused on the individual. The aggregate doesn't describe, because humans are characteristically unique and individual. So that's a scientific attitude of staying very, very close to the fact that everyone is different. And it's one of the reasons that I'm, drawn to and connected to and learn a lot from Carl Jung, who had a lot of problems. I have a lot of criticisms with Carl Jung, but even though he took psychosis and schizophrenia and madness very seriously, even though he also took mystical experiences and religious experiences very seriously, he was very, very committed to science. He saw himself as someone who's committed to empirical research, but it also includes listening to people's subjective experience. That's also data. Data isn't just observation. Data is also listening to measurement, because there's a lot of, in fact, how do you measure love? We could easily say that love is the most important thing. How do you measure it? How do you measure consciousness? Consciousness, which is so self-evident. And yet, if you go to the neuroscientists who are focused on the measurement end of the spectrum, they will debate whether consciousness even exists. So clearly, there's a lot of human experience that is fundamentally real and amenable to science, but maybe in the end of the scientific spectrum that's not about measurement and objective and behavior and these kinds of definitions.
It's funny you bring that up, because I don't know if you know who Brene Brown is.
Sure, yeah.
So a couple of years ago, I picked up one of her books, and I don't always read the foreword in the introduction, but I did on that one. And she mentioned that in graduate school, there were kind of two groups of people, one who believed in the quantitative data and the group who believed in the qualitative data. And she said that she was in the qualitative data, which is more the stories, which is more the individual. And as soon as she said that, I thought, oh, that's the difference between designed experiments and observational studies. And so like, you mentioned things like consciousness, imagery, intensity of memory, that type of thing. We can't measure that yet.
Right.
And I thought, oh, we need to be doing a lot more observational studies. So it's just interesting that you touched on that as well. And that's part of what I want to, at some point, bring into the conversation.
Absolutely.
That, hey, by narrowing in on this, you're ignoring these other analytical tools or way of looking at it, because it drives me nuts. Sometimes this is it's like,
there's so
what
much,
are you guys doing?
There's so much logical fallacy. I mean, when you step into the conversations around psychiatry, if you step into an interview with a psychiatrist or a social worker or a doctor or a nurse, you will very quickly start to get stuff that doesn't make sense, that there's so many logical fallacies or lapses of reason on the side of the medical science. And then you try and challenge it or talk your way against it. And then, of course, that's seen as non-compliance. It's seen as lack of insight. It's seen as a symptom of your illness. So ironically, psychiatry, which stands for reason and sanity, is itself very crazy. It's a very crazy making discipline. It's a very crazy making aspect of medicine that I think in itself, it can kind of fuel and drive people into that state of frustration and desperation. Like, you're not making any sense. Why can you? Here you're supposed to, one of the most basic one is, here you are, you say you're helping me, but you're not listening to me when I'm telling you that you're not helping me. And it's just a lot of crazy making kinds of logical contradictions in psychiatry.
But it's interesting because a lot of people, there's the anti-psychiatry, critical psychiatry. But for me, the real issue is the problem of a bad model to begin with. Which is, because I've run into people who, have I should say, in my experience back in the late 90s, who had master's degrees in psychology or that they didn't recognize, or they bought into enough of the biochemical imbalance theory. So even though they weren't a psychiatrist, to me, the bigger problem is we don't have a good model, or at least the dominant model. Is that something?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so much here in what you're saying, but I'm really inspired and really interested in looking at the science from a scientific perspective, because I don't think that we should be anti-science, but I think we should be anti-science as it's conceived today, because it's become a technician's project. It's become a very instrumental, a very industry oriented. It's become not something that I think is true science. I think you can make a very strong case that psychiatry is a pseudoscience, that it simply doesn't have a consistent object of study. It doesn't have a clear definition. It's driven more by dogma and faith than actual scientific conclusions. And there's a lot of people in the medical field that feel this way, that they are very suspect of a lot of the things that so then you have to say, well, why is it that psychiatry persists? Well, it's because there's a social need to respond to suffering and also to respond to the need to control people. So I wouldn't say psychiatry is purely social control, but it does have that aspect of what do we do with our son who won't let us sleep at night because he's acting so disruptive and it doesn't fit with how he was a year ago. Okay, now we're going to lean on psychiatry. So it has that social control aspect, but it also has an aspect of how do we help people when we feel helpless. Now, if we were honest, we would stay with those questions. Okay, what is going on when someone is so-called out of control, or what is going on when we want to help somebody? But instead, psychiatry just makes all these assumptions. It doesn't examine its assumptions, and that's what I think makes it a pseudoscience, because the assumptions are, like you say, a bad model. The assumptions are based on wrong foundations. I mean, there's a very interesting philosopher, historian of science, Thomas Kuhn. I don't know if you know his work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he basically says that we think of science as proceeding by the accumulation of facts. You just get more and more facts, and then you just have to build theories that just fit all the facts that you've got, and then you're going to have better and better theories. This is not how science proceeds. Science is incredibly contentious. There are dominant paradigms in science. There are controversial fringe, we could say, paradigms, and then suddenly it'll switch. That the fringe paradigm becomes dominant. I mean, quantum physics is a great example. And when scientists started coming out with quantum theories about how the universe was structured based on their observations of particles, a lot of people in the physics field were like, this is ridiculous. This is just mysticism. This is not. And now those are considered establishment. So science proceeds through conflict, through the dominance of one set of questions, and then other questions that are pushed to the side and then there are these crescendos of the conflict where suddenly there's a shift, and then there's a new paradigm that comes in. So that's, I think, a much more, and then once you introduce an understanding of the sociology of science and the political economy, you recognize that science is driven by industry and by profit and by public policy that's also driven by industry and profit. Where's the research money come from? You realize that these paradigms of science are incredibly political and incredibly shaped by the economics and the profit and the power interests. So science isn't this accumulation of facts giving us better and better theories as we march to a brighter progress. It's an incredibly contentious realm that's completely contaminated by politics and by economics, as well as by power interests and the industry and the cartels, the way in which pharma and the psychiatric industry, the hospital industry, the insurance industry all operate to kind of keep a dominant grip on what questions we can ask and what questions we can't ask, what assumptions we're going to assume, and the assumptions that we are not going to question, the assumptions that we're not going to examine.
With regard to science, I think it was Sami Tamimi in the UK. I first heard him use the phrase scientism.
Scientism, yeah.
Is that something you've come across, or just?
Well, sure. It's like it's a
because that's what you're describing.
Neurobabble. It's a like, pick up the New York Times, open up CNN. I mean, we don't have, I think rightly, we don't have a dominant priesthood or a dominant religious caste that's telling us how to live our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have like that authority anymore. It was dethroned by, the American Revolution and the overcoming of monarchy and the development of the Enlightenment. And so the priesthood has kind of been put aside, but people are kind of left with, and so we've kind of enthroned science. but not science in the sense of what actually science is. We've given science this kind of authority, this illegitimate authority to not to be anti-science again, but this illegitimate authority to answer questions that are basically about human values. And then it's seeped into the whole culture so that pretty soon people are talking about, well, I've got to rewire my brain in order to be able to have better study habits with school. Like you're using a metaphor that you think is backed up by science, but it's actually just babble. You're just reproducing a kind of scientism that's about the dogmatic adherence to saying that, okay, I'm going to worship these authorities by using a certain scientific kind of language to justify choices that I'm making in my life that are human choices. They're not derived by scientific authority, but we've ceded the human to the scientific expert in a very dangerous way, I think.
Interesting point, the seeding of the human to that.
Yeah.
And now I have my own theories and things as such, but for me, what were the biggest problems you ran into in your own experiences? I should take a moment that you went through, do you call it a psychotic break, or you went through experiences back in the early 90s?
Right. Well, I appreciate using the word experiences and asking about how for a while I did call it a psychotic break.
Okay.
I wanted to be schizophrenic. I wanted to have a mental disorder. I really wanted to. It would solve so many problems. I would have an explanation for why I've had difficulties in my life. I've had severe difficulties in my life, and would offer a pathway to solving those problems. I really wanted the diagnosis to work for me, but it didn't. It didn't because of trial and error. I just didn't, the medications didn't work. Things got worse in my life. And so the experience started out being something that I didn't even think about or talk about or understand at all. And then I was overwhelmed. And then I went into the psychiatric system. Then I was told this is schizoaffective disorder. It's a thought disorder. It's a genetic brain malfunction. Essentially, you need medications for the rest of your life. I believed that for a while.
And how old were you?
I was 26.
Okay.
So I'm 58 now. So it was quite a while. This is in the 90s. Yeah. And then I stepped away from psychiatry and I got very, very confused. All I knew is that didn't work, that way of understanding, but I was still in this kind of middle. And then I developed an understanding through the trauma framework. I got very, very interested, and I still am. I think it's a very important and extremely useful framework. And for a while, that was my identity. I'm a trauma survivor. I have the trauma explains the traumatic mechanisms of dissociation and the traumatic mechanisms of fight and flight and nervous system activation and denial and fragmentation of the psyche. This all explains everything that I was calling schizophrenia. And then before, I just understood as my difficulties or my distress. Now I've moved away from, I still understand trauma. I still see it as a very useful framework. But I think that the trauma framework can be very limiting. So now I have, maybe we could say, a more spiritual understanding, or a more maybe conflict, an idea of cultural conflict, that I'm maybe outside of a certain cultural frame. And that because I stepped outside of that cultural frame, I'm in conflict with the dominant culture. But if you put me in a different cultural frame, like let's imagine, say, an indigenous culture or a tribal culture, there wouldn't be any conflict at all. Maybe I would be completely normal in that. I'm speculating. I haven't had that experience. Now, what's coming, I don't know. I mean, we'll see. I mean, Jungian psychology has been very interesting to me. Mysticism has been very interesting to me. But I'm less interested in the arrival at solutions than I am in the dialogue and conversations and the inquiry and the exploration, the process of getting there, because it's going to keep changing. I mean, I was mentioning gender and sexuality. The evolution of our understanding of gender and sexuality over the past 20 years is incredible. But people make the mistake of thinking that we've arrived. And no, there's, I mean, I talk, especially I have young people that I work with in my practice. I mean, the way in which people are exploring themselves and coming to identities for them. There's people that don't even identify as human, that identify as spirit, or they identify as animal, or they identify, and then people are really asking very, very deep questions that raise to me like, what's coming next? What is the future of these explorations? And I think it has a lot to do with focusing on the questions and the exploration and the listening, the deep, deep listening to who we are. I'm very fascinated by biology and the biology of mind. There's a very strong argument to be made that humans are not individuals, that we're not actually solitary individual, that if you look physically at who we are, most of the cells in our body are not from human DNA, they're from bacteria, they're from microorganisms, that our digestive system, our thinking is actually a collaboration with an ensemble of non-human DNA organisms, the way in which the microbiome, the gut bacteria that we have are deeply, deeply implicated in our emotions, in our thinking. So where do we start and when do we stop? And so are we really individual? You see, so I think that the questioning, the exploration, that's what excites me. That's what interests me.
And even as you're describing this, I'm thinking back to the answer you gave to a previous question where you were talking about the sociology and the bigness, and now it's tied to the more micro level within a body, the bacteria, the biology of it. And it reminds me, I think it was Richard Feynman, who was a physicist, had a quote.
Richard,
on one string and it unravels the whole thing, right? And just even this conversation goes everywhere. And it also ties in though with, I don't know if, not necessarily religions, but kind of theories. There's the Gaia theory, there's the Tao of the Eastern religion,
absolutely,
the quantum of everything being interconnected. And for me, that's part of what I experienced, is following everything through it's all interconnected, from the largest to the large, flipping an inverse as a math person and getting to the smallest of the small.
Absolutely. You mentioned Richard Feynman. I mean, I love how he's able to start his talks, and people should check him out on YouTube if you haven't, or wherever if you haven't. He'll start with a simple observation. Well, why is it that something bumps into something else, and then the thing it bumps into suddenly shoots in the same direction? Like, why is that? He'll just ask, like, why is that? He'll start with an observation, and then he'll be able to break down the different theories and the different mechanisms in physics or in chemistry that allow us to make predictions that we can then test. Now, you could say, like, if we're talking about psychiatry, we're talking about mental health, why are we suddenly talking about gut bacteria and mysticism and religion? Well, it's because psychiatry has covered up all these questions, that basically psychiatry steps in and claims to answer, what is the meaning of life? Who are humans? What is the human mind? How does the human mind, what is consciousness? It acts as if all these questions have been answered illegitimately, and just says, oh, depression is when your serotonin levels are too low. Take this pill, they'll boost up. And then you're like, okay, I'll go ahead. But it's a deeply, deeply illegitimate science, because it's wrapped all these assumptions under this mystification of expertise. And I think most dangerously is it people surrender the questions that they should be asking themselves. Like, I'm a parent. I have a son who wants to be an artist. Is that okay for me? Everyone else in the family is a lawyer or in business.
Right.
Is it okay for me to have a son who's an artist? That question is a deep question that I think parents maybe need to ask. They don't ask it because they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, your son's bipolar. That's why he sits in his room all day and smokes weed and creates games on his computer, because he's bipolar, not because the question is being raised in your family. What does it mean to be successful?
Right.
What is a meaningful life? Is smoking weed and creating games on your computer, is that a meaningful life, or do you have to be a lawyer? Psychiatry just abolishes all of those meaningful questions about what it is to be human, and then smuggles an answer through pseudoscience and says, oh, it's a chemical imbalance. Clearly you need to take a pill.
And it's interesting because even that dynamic, there's so much subconscious communication between, say, a child and parent, where the child knows
Mm.
they're not meeting the expectations, or they feel
Mm-hmm.
something that is going to disappoint the parents. Or do you know what I mean? There's
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. But I want to get back to, it's come up a couple times, and I react strongly when you say it, is the assumptions.
The
Because,
assumptions.
again, tying in with the science part of it, when you come up with a statistical model, there's always assumptions. But
Mm-hmm.
part of the science is to go back and validate the assumptions you've made.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my thing, is, that I would get diagnosed without any adequate assessment or consideration of
Mm-hmm.
past traumatic experiences, the
Mm-hmm.
current systems I'm in, and are
Mm-hmm.
they functional? Are they dysfunctional? What's the state? And so it seems like context
Context. Yeah. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
seriously lacking in a lot of this. And
Well,
I
that's,
guess
I
by
think,
your
the,
reaction that you're kind of like, yeah.
well, the idea, well, again, it's the idea that the brain or the individual is a context history-free machine. It's a context history-free machine. You flip it on, does it work or does it not work? And actually, that's not how the brain operates and how the mind operates. It's completely context dependent. That with the mechanistic view that you can discretely separate something and look at its functioning separate from the surround and the context and the field in which it's part of, is an assumption. Now, the problem with assumptions isn't that we make assumptions. We all make assumptions. The problem with assumptions is that we hide them. So I work with people all the time who take medications.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, yeah, the doctor will tell you that, how does this medication work? And the doctor will say, well, this medication is boosting your dopamine, or it's boosting your serotonin, or calming your overactive dopamine. And I would say, well, that's an assumption that comes from a certain paradigm or a certain way that psychiatry has. How much evidence is for that assumption? I should say a lot of evidence that assumption is basically groundless, but that's an assumption that they're making. We can start from other assumptions. We can say, well, actually, this drug is a psychoactive substance. If you give Prozac to anyone, they're going to have maybe a placebo reaction. They might have a reaction to the stimulant qualities of Prozac, whether or not they have a diagnosis of depression. If you give Seroquel to anyone, it's going to quiet them down. They might have a reaction to it. They might have a paradoxical reaction. They might have akathisia, or they might have some kind of agitation. But for a lot of people, Seroquel is going to be a sedating drug. What if we start from an assumption that says that these are psychoactive drugs that affect anyone? Antipsychotics are given to animals. They're used in wildlife management and in zoos. They're used by veterinarians. So let's start with an assumption that says these are psychoactive chemicals. Actually, that fits the evidence a lot more than the assumption that these are treating disease processes in the mechanistic brain. And then let's follow that assumption. Okay, is it useful to you? Yeah, okay. It can sedate you. It can reassure your family, which can be calming. It can help maybe boost your attention in taking tests. It can stave off withdrawal effects. It can help you to sleep. It can shut down an overactive part of your mind. Why is your mind overactive? It might be overactive for good reasons, but this sedative can shut it down. Is that useful to you? Let's start from an assumption that says it's not a disease process that we have to get rid of because it's going to kill you or poison you. But let's start from an assumption it's a psychoactive drug that has effects like getting high. Are those effects useful relative to the costs of those effects? Now, that is a model that fits the evidence dramatically much more than the psychiatric disease chemical imbalance model. But it's still a set of assumptions. It's a set of assumptions. A harm reduction model of psychiatric drugs is a set of assumptions. I hope that it's a transparent set of assumptions. It's set up and supported by a lot more evidence that I hope is more transparent. But you could have another set of assumptions. You could have a set of assumptions that says that God has given me the opportunity to make a choice in this moment. I have found you by synchronicity. It's a miracle that I'm being offered this alternative to, and so everything is about God's plan. That's another set of assumptions that you can make. And there's actually a lot of evidence that would suggest that that's a valid set of assumptions. It's a different kind of evidence, but who am I to say that someone telling me that they're making an existential choice based on pros and cons is a more true
Right.
understanding and a more true set of assumptions than someone saying that this moment is all God's glory and it's all shaped by God, and all of my choices and all the benefit I give gratitude to God for. Who am I to challenge that? What I want to do is I can help create a set of assumption, a clarity about what assumptions go into each, but it's up to each individual. I'm not going to touch
It's,
that decision.
it,
I want people to make that on their own.
well, it's fascinating because your description of the medications and the drugs, even in my experience, I went through 4 months of sheer hell after the initial, what I call a
I believe
breakdown.
it. I believe it.
And I always thought, hey, the drugs and medications could be tools potentially. But if you guys would just back off and let me settle down on my own first.
It's a tool. It's a tool, but it's a tool, but it's a hammer that it keeps hitting you in the face.
It doesn't have to be a hammer. That's my
right,
point.
Yeah, it's a dangerous tool. It's a saw that keeps cutting off fingers.
But then the other part is, and of course, see, my background in statistics, and I knew people before my own experience who had been diagnosed with things like bipolar and schizophrenia. A couple people, rejected the diagnosis, said that, and then others accepted. And, I knew one person who was taking basically a drug cocktail and always tweaking and stuff. And I was like, but look at the quality of your life. You're not able to function in society. Is this working for you? And of course, you can only approach that so much. But with my background in statistics, I was like, when you start putting 5, 6, 7, 8 drugs together, for me, that gets a little scary just because, they haven't been tested.
There's no research about this,
and so that was
pharmacology of synergetic.
And that's why for me, it was like, hey, let's back up here. But you also mentioned
madness. It's madness.
Yeah. What you also mentioned was the attitudes and or the assumptions people have, kind of. And as you were describing that, I was thinking in terms of framework, that we all build a model of
absolutely a set of assumptions. Framework of assumptions.
And for me, it was like that model exploded in that process and fractured and fragmented. And so I actually look at it as kind of like the Kintsukuri process, which is the Japanese art form, where
remind me.
I'll send you a link, but it's basically like a bowl that is broken.
Okay, I do remember that
together with gold, and it
to
has
represent greater beauty.
It has more value and it's
considered more perfect to include its own fault.
For that process, and so just even this collection of assumptions, and to me, when that framework or that collection of assumptions, is trying to grow in perhaps a different direction,
right?
That can be very painful. And I think that ties in with what you were saying, kind of the N=1, the individual approach of what context and what stuff is going on there. So, one of the things I'm looking at time, and I know we have a little bit here. So
we're just getting started, Penny.
I know. Let's get to another one. but I do want to touch on because see, I was lucky that with my background in statistics and recognizing, hey, the drugs and medication route, if what I want to try first doesn't help let me heal, that's always an option. And so I actually didn't have to reject drugs and medication. But I also then, so the 4 months of sheer hell for me was trying to save my job in a corporate environment.
Oh, yeah.
You want me to do this? You want me to do that? There were 4 termination dates floating around.
Wow. Wow.
And I do believe it was God's way of getting me out, saying, hey, what are you doing here?
Well, now we're getting into the more Jungian realm. I just have a quick comment about that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our healthcare and our housing was not contingent on holding on to our jobs desperately? Right. Wouldn't we have so much more freedom to figure out what we need to do to take care of ourselves if we didn't live under a brutal neoliberal greed capitalism that makes people are literally afraid of living in their cars and not having health insurance if they lose their jobs, or they decide to change careers, or they step away from their work for a while.
And that ties in with the power imbalance. For me, it comes down to, for what came through my experience was abusive systems.
Yeah.
Systems become actually not just dysfunctional, but actually abusive.
And absolutely crazy. Like,
What's that?
crazy? Are you crazy, or are you responding in a normal way to a crazy system that's abusive?
Right.
You know,
And
that absolutely.
I know you've used that phrase. I think you have it on one of the pages in your website, crazy in a crazy world.
Yeah, that's the Madness Radio tagline. What does it
Okay.
mean? What
And
does
I
it
had
mean?
used that even
What does it mean
before.
to be called crazy in a crazy world? Yeah.
Well, and I take it a step further, and I had thought even before the experience, if you go crazy in a crazy world, are you sane?
Exactly.
-1 times -1 is +1.
Well, it's the fallacy of the herd, that just or the fallacy of appeal to the masses or appeal to authority. Just
Right.
because the majority of people believe something doesn't make it logical. It just means that it has political power, it has dominance.
Right. And it goes
But
to
it's
consensus.
a logical fallacy.
Yeah, it goes to consensus reality, split from reality.
Dominant reality. Well, I want to jump in. I want to jump in real quickly and just say, when we were talking about frameworks and assumptions, because I know you're a deeply spiritual, religious person, as I am, is it possible to not have frameworks and assumptions?
It's interesting. So one, I consider myself spiritual, not necessarily religious. To me, they're
Sure, yeah.
But and I even say you could say I'm insanely spiritual in some.
Okay, I like that.
Way.
I'm insanely spiritual.
I still get signs. I get synchronicity.
Yeah,
all over
I do
the place.
too. I do too.
But I question that in terms of functioning in this world. That I think there are some frameworks that maybe we need to operate within this world. But in terms of understanding the bigness, to me, your question reminds me of the Tao from the Eastern religions. I don't mean the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
Right.
But it goes to that concept of the oneness, the bigness.
Well, I think what's intriguing about Taoism, I'm not Chinese, I haven't studied this from that context at all. But what's intriguing to me, what's compelling to me, and I think it speaks directly to this question of what is it possible to have no framework, is the fact that in the Tao Te Ching, which is it's one of the greatest, I mean, it's definitely up there with the Bible, if not more popular, the Tao Te Ching, which is basically the writing of Taoism. And first thing it says is disregard this writing.
Right.
This is not, if you can say it, if you can speak it, now that paradox, I think, gets to the heart of, is it possible to not have a framework while not making no framework your new framework? You see, because people talk about, oh, I don't want to have attachments. Well, you're very attached
to not having attachments.
Attachments. People say be here now as if it's something you can do. Like, you're already here now always. You can't not be here now. So the question, I think, is still compelling. What would it be like to not have a framework, or to be able to hold any framework so loosely that you could move to a different framework? And without a need of any framework to guide you? What would be guiding you? Would it be God? Would it be nature? It probably wouldn't be your free will, would it? These are questions that these are questions that I spend my time
on.
A
couple things. One, because to me, what we're really talking about is the philosophy. There's the philosophical aspect of that can come from these types of journeys, because that framework, to me, is no longer holding. And so,
or the fact that
developing other frameworks or philosophies that,
or the fact that we all have philosophies, we just don't examine them. And so maybe a breakdown or a breakthrough is a time when because I think a lot of, in terms of conflict, like I think of the psyche or human experience as being about different parts and pieces, and some of them are coextensive with the whole universe, some of them are very deeply held and intimate. But that and the work or the approach that I have is creating conversations This is what Jung was fundamentally about. It's like you create conversations between all these different parts or these different experiences that you're having. And so is it possible to somehow be in a conflict to the point where you break through your whole framework? The only way out of the conflict is by blowing up the entire frame. And I think and it could be a creative act to
agree,
break through. And because then you create the opportunity for a new framework to come in. Now, is there something in the psyche that says, I need to grow? I'm a seed and I need to put roots down. I need to put shoots up so that I can get to the surface. And then once I get to the surface, I need to reach for the sun. My sense and my observation is that people seem to be moving towards some kind of growth, often through conflict that they perceive as just, I need to stop being depressed. But actually, your depression might be teaching you need to get out of your job. You're living in an abusive relationship is not the way. You need to grow through your job or grow through your abusive relationship. And this thing that you hate, the depression, it's actually your best friend because it's helping you to move to growth that your ordinary self, your ego, or your framework that you're stuck in can't see. And I would never prescribe that. I would never tell somebody that's what's going on but the truth is a lot of people who get a terminal illness or they get a cancer diagnosis, so they go through some tragedy. And I heard you say a little bit about this before. Once they come through it, or maybe in the process of struggling with it, they start to almost have a gratitude towards that because of what it's taught them.
Right.
And then you can say, did they need that lesson? Is whether there's something inside of them that actually helped create that experience to get them to the next place that they needed to go?
For me, I wouldn't say it was a conscious thing, but it was an awakening.
Yeah.
It was awakening. There was a specific event that one way I describe it is that I was taking all that toxicity. And even early on in Banff, I thought I was letting it all roll off my back, all the bad stuff, but it was really getting stuffed into a glass ball.
Getting stuffed into,
And so a specific event came along and whacked it hard enough and all that exploded. And for me, there was an explosion and an implosion. But as I look back on it, I would say that I was stuffing all that off into the shadow. I'm a huge Jungian fan. That it was getting stuffed into the shadow and the shadow exploded.
Yeah, I mean, are we just our conscious mind? Well, actually, I mean, if you pay attention, you notice that you're doing all kinds of, most of your life is on autopilot. Who's driving, who's at the steering wheel of the autopilot? Well, that's also you, but it's a different aspect. It's a different part. It's a different, and so this, I think, can be very useful. There's an essay called The Paradoxical Theory of Change. And it talks about how, and this is something I do quite a lot, people come in and they want to get rid of something. They want to get rid of their depression. They want to get rid of their voices, and they've been fighting for so long. I'm not going to come up with any new way for you to get rid of your depression. You've already thought about going for walks and you've already thought about writing in your journal. What happens if we actually paradoxically welcome the thing that we're against and say, oh, well, what's in your depression? Can you show me some of your depression? What happens in that depressive state? When I was in the hospital for the first time, they checked a box, he's hearing voices. They never asked me what the voices were saying or what they sounded like, or when did I first start hearing them, or what did the voices want me to do, or what is it they're yelling at me? But I think paradoxically, if we turn towards that part of us that we're in conflict with, then it may release the next step in the process of why it's there in the first place.
It's interesting because even that leaning in part reminds me of a quote from Joseph Campbell, who had the hero's journey, and belly flopping into mysticism comes from one of his quotes, where he said the psychotic person drowns in the same water which mystic delights in. And my passion growing up was synchronized swimming, and I almost drowned in that process. But he also said the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek.
Yeah.
And so
I'm thinking of, I mean, it's a long tradition. I mean, Rilke, the Letters to a Young Poet is a book that's marvelous. for this intuitive. It's an intuitive understanding. It's a way, it's a framework of understanding human experience that's very ancient. And it reappears in literature and poetry and philosophy all over the world again and again.
And to me, that ties in with the more artistic components, rather than just so much scientific. What can we measure? What is your brain doing? What is
are you productive? A lot of artists, I mean, now there's such an industrial artist approach, but a lot of artists understand that I'm not on a conveyor belt. I'm not on a clock. I go through 3 days of being depressed, lying in bed, watching YouTube videos. And then on the 4th day, boom, I'm 6 hours in front of a canvas and I just created. So there's not a linear process. There can be a creative process where the part, and if you pathologize, if you hate those depressive parts of yourself, you're denying yourself the gestation or the process that you need to go through to get to the artistic explosion. And it's a fundamental thing about human creativity and human being that psychiatry just has no understanding. They absolutely will not welcome any of the positive, generative, necessary, instructive aspects of the psyche as long as they don't fit the productive model. They're just seen as the diseased part that we have to get rid of. That's just not how the psyche works.
Right. Are you familiar with James Davies' work out of the UK?
Sure. Yeah.
His 2 most recent books are Cracked, and I forget the subtitle, but it has to do with the poor process in determining the DSM. And the second, the most recent was Sedated: How Modern Capitalism contributed to develop the mental health crisis. But his first book is actually The Importance of Suffering. And when you're talking about the potential value, and that's not to say suffering isn't painful, isn't, difficult, and isn't even dangerous, in terms of, there are people, there are people who think they can fly and jump off things, or there are people
who kill themselves.
And that, So I don't want to minimize that, but there's a thing to say that the suffering, there's reasons behind it. And when you were describing that, I was thinking of his book as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's common sense. I mean, it's the basis of world religion and spirituality. It's the basis of human culture, that we understand that we grow through suffering and tragedy. We create initiation rites, which inflict pain and suffering as part of a passage to adulthood. I mean, it's the most fundamental, and yet psychiatry has no understanding of it. It completely makes that, just pushes it out the window. The reason it does is because a factory, you have a damaged part in a factory or a broken part inside of a computer. No, from the framework of the factory, it serves no purpose. You just have to get rid of it or fix it. So it's a framework of productivity and efficiency and machine-like a function that is imposed. And if you want to see your life, there are people who are into transhumanism and Google whatever fitness monitors. I'm betraying my own bias because all that stuff scares me. But there are people that want to see the world through that framework of, am I productive?
Right.
That's a choice, but let's talk about the assumptions that you're making. Don't smuggle in capitalist productivity assumptions behind the scenes and then call it science. That's illegit. That's pseudoscience.
Right. And often that decision isn't a conscious decision. It's conditioning, it's training, it's programming.
Following the herd. It's following the herd. It's being surrounded by everyone. The New York Times is telling you, think in terms of neuroscience and productivity, and that's what you, and then you get scared, because how can you be different than other people? Because in a brutal capitalist society that we live in, if you drop behind, you are going to be sleeping in your car. You're not going to have your health insurance. You are going to go bankrupt from medical debt. So I really appreciate that you're bringing this in, because I think one of the big mistakes that we make along with psychiatry is that the problems exist within the individual biography and the individual psyche and the individual biology, and they don't. It's a crisis of society. It's a crisis of connection. It's a crisis of community. It's a crisis of relationship. Someone comes into my work and they say, hey, my son is, he's in his room playing video games all the time and talking about hearing voices, and he won't eat and he's up all the middle of the night. If I assume that the problem is with him, I'm not going to see the larger context of the family. And if I assume that the problem is with the so-called larger context of the family, I'm not going to see the larger issues of the society. And I start to become an enforcer of society is normal. We need to adapt to society, and it's the individuals or the family that are the problem that we have to fix. And this is, I think, fundamental, because if we keep chasing solutions to the mental health problems through better mental health treatment, we're going to miss the social context. And this is a problem that I see with a lot of the critical psychiatry and the push for the recovery movement and peer specialists. It's just not going to work unless we have guaranteed housing. It's not going to work if you don't have childcare. It's not going to work. It's like you're never going to solve the problem of domestic abuse and domestic violence and women being beaten by their partners if they don't have affordable apartments that they can go rent to get out of those situations.
And a sense of safety and security. Yeah.
Where are they going to go? Do they actually have a place in society that they can, because people stay in abusive relationships often for economic and for reasons that they don't have those options. So we're never going to solve the so-called mental health problem until we deal with the housing crisis. Not because mental health causes the housing crisis. I think it's the other way around. The housing crisis isn't mysterious. It's capitalist greed in a predatory marketplace run amok without any regulation. That's why we have homelessness. And it also has to do with our spending priorities at a federal government. If we just took some money out of our military, not even that much, we could solve homelessness overnight. But fundamentally, it's not about you have a broken society, then you tax it, and then you pay for social spending to solve. No, you deal with the brokenness of the society. There's reasons why we have mental health crises, and we have to look at those reasons. It's deeply connected to poverty and disconnection and the lack of meaningful contribution.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, we were talking about the oneness and the bigness, and even in what you described, instead of looking at kind of the individual cell and looking down into the specifics, going out bigger gives more illumination. And and also, as you described that, I know you were interviewed in Crazy Wise, the documentary, and I actually had a chance to interview Phil Borges.
Oh, great.
He agreed right away. And in that documentary, Dr. Gabor Mate was also. Are you familiar with Gabor's?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, because he and his son wrote the book, The Myth of Normal. Which is, as you were describing that, I thought, and again, I'm a statistician, I'm thinking this normal distribution. And it's like we're all here and this normal distribution needs to be over here.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, I'm noticing that I think we've been talking for about an hour, and I try and wind it down, but you're still working on your PhD.
I am.
And you, I know you have other interviews. I will include links to various things, the outside mental health. And I did want to touch a little bit, because again, I didn't have to deal with the medication and the drug withdrawal. Could you just just describe a little bit what this guide that you worked on?
Yeah, so it's the harm reduction.
In case people are interested in that.
Yeah, so the harm reduction guide to coming off psychiatric drugs, I think it's in maybe 16 or 17 languages now. It's a free download. You can get it off of willhall.net. And it came out of many, 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 many hours of support group meetings where we sat together in groups in Northampton, Massachusetts, and listened to different people's experience about medications. And a lot of people were telling us, oh, it is, my doctor says that Klonopin isn't addictive. Is Klonopin addictive? And then we would look at each other like, you realize that the benzodiazepines are more addictive to heroin. Oh, my doctor never. There was such a huge gap of just basic information about medications, and then a huge gap about even the possibility of living with this diagnosis and not taking medications. That yes, there are lots of people who have the worst kind of diagnosis and they don't take medications. Everyone is different. Your process, your path, your way is going to have to be something that you explore, because we also encountered there was anti-drug messaging out there from some groups, and we didn't, that just didn't make sense to us. Like, why would you start to just be anti when psychiatry is so pro, when everybody has had a different experience? I mean, yeah, there are people who are anti-alcohol, and I'm in some ways sympathetic to that, but we also know that there's lots of people that drink alcohol sustainably. So, but we also know that people are honest about the risks of alcohol. So I don't have an anti-drug approach
Right.
to any of the drugs. I question whether the antipsychotics and the SSRIs ever should have been marketed or even invested into the research because of the lack of actual efficacy in the studies. So I question that. But ultimately, if someone is on a drug and it's useful for them on their own terms, and they have informed consent and they're looking at their options, they may not have, then I'm not going to judge them. So we developed a harm reduction approach that everybody is different and it's your choice. And we really felt like that's what was missing. There wasn't enough information about drugs, coming off drugs, and there wasn't enough of the supportive approach that valued people to make their own choices, including staying on drugs or lowering their dose or changing their dose or increasing or whatever they. But the problem was that they were being bullied essentially by psychiatry and the industry. So the harm reduction guide to psychiatric drugs sort of brings together a lot of the basic learning that we developed in that, and it's a free download. And people say that it's been helpful to them. I see it as one piece of a learning journey. I want people to check out Surviving Antidepressants and the Inner Compass Withdrawal Project, and I want people to check out different support and different books and different sources that they can. Since I wrote that guide, there's been a lot more that's come out about withdrawal, which I'm very grateful for. But people can download it off of my website on the internet for free.
Okay. Yeah, no, great. Because like I say, that's an area that I was lucky I didn't have to deal with. And I recognize too that, it's each person determining without the bullying, as you mentioned, hey, am I to a point where I want to look into this? But I also know that there are people that, and I want to mention that the main thing I understand about withdrawal is don't go cold turkey.
Well, it's really interesting.
So what's your take on that?
It's very interesting you say that. So again, variability and again, diversity. You're absolutely right. As a rule of thumb, cold turkey is going to create problems. People don't have the information that they need to understand that these drugs are essentially addictive, that they change brain chemistry in a way that the brain now is dependent on the drug, just exactly the same way that if you drink coffee every day, you've changed your brain chemistry, so now you're reliant on the caffeine coming in. Having said that, it is true that some people do go off of certain psychiatric drugs abruptly, cold turkey, and they are successful. The research base shows that yes, some people are successful. It may be more dangerous, but it's also dangerous to stay on the drugs. Even if you're reducing slowly, you're increasing your exposure time. So I would not have a dogma, and I certainly wouldn't enforce you have to do it this way, and I absolutely would not blame people. If you've tried to come off your meds abruptly and it didn't work and you went back on, yeah, now maybe you might want to try more slowly, but I don't blame you for wanting to come off the meds. The side effects are horrible. And it wasn't an irrational thing to do. It was something that you tried that had an unknown outcome. Right. And there are situations where if you're on a psychiatric med, there are certain clinical indications that you have to come off abruptly. If you're on Lamictal and you get a rash, you're coming off cold turkey because it's going to kill you.
Yeah.
If you're on antipsychotics and you start to get organ damage, or you start to get tardive dyskinesia, or you start to get the indications with your white blood cell count, or you start to get neuroleptic syndrome, then you're in very serious danger from staying on that drug. And so abrupt withdrawal may make a lot of sense. Drugs like the benzos, you come off of them, they can cause seizure. There can even be sudden death from abrupt withdrawal from some psychiatric drugs, but sudden death is also a risk from staying on them. So a general rule of thumb is to be smart. Think about going slow is maybe the best. But if someone, I mean, if you start having like pre-diabetic symptoms and you're really scared of getting diabetes and you have very serious metabolic side effects, and you come to me and you say, Will, I just came off of my drugs cold turkey, I'm going to tell you that's your choice. It makes a lot of sense given the toxicity. Some people are able to come off the drugs cold turkey. It may mean support, having a place to be, being able to ride out very severe withdrawal symptoms. But for some people, withdrawal symptoms are experienced more severe than others. Everybody is different. So I
Well,
would never
I'm
say you must come off slowly, but I would seriously caution coming off cold turkey without realizing what you might
what
be
could happen,
risking
right?
getting into, but also staying on or even going slow. You're
Right.
risking, I mean, tardive dyskinesia is a serious neurological disorder that creates cognitive
Yeah,
problems. You stay on SSRIs long enough, you start to risk that your sexual response, your ability to have arousal and orgasm could be damaged, not just while you're on the drug, but for the rest of your life. These are
yeah,
very, very, very serious side effects. So if someone makes a calculation, yeah, I'm gonna risk cold turkey because I'm done and I'm terrified of the side effects, I'm not gonna judge them or blame them for
right.
doing.
Okay. Well, no, and I'm thankful I asked that question, just
Yeah,
because,
yeah. It's a
in so
great
many
question.
places, the advice is generally, don't go cold turkey. And,
I
but
don't give
really is,
advice. I don't give
what's that?
advice. I don't give advice
Yeah.
because
And,
I would give advice if I was certain about
right.
if I felt certain. I feel certain to give the advice and be informed because I think
Okay.
that but even with that, I mean, some people, maybe they are going to get more confused and overwhelmed by maybe they always have treated their health as a religious and sacred
Mhm.
approach and they want to go with what, I mean, I don't know, I can speculate about different people's relationship to advice, but I'm very, very cautious about saying this is the right way to do things
Right.
because I
Okay.
just don't know. I think it's illegitimate for me to be predicting the future when I don't know. When I do feel very confident, then yeah, I'm gonna give you some advice, and you might want to think twice
Right.
about quitting your job because you might be homeless. That I think is, I'm not going to tell you don't quit your job because you're going to
But
be homeless,
consider,
but because the job it might be better to be homeless for a while and get out of that job that you see what I'm saying? I want to
yeah,
be,
I do. Yeah.
really honest about not being in the expert role of being able to predict the future, if that makes sense.
No, to me, that's refreshing.
Yeah.
I think, I hate to say, but I think you're in a minority in terms of within the industry. And I think that is part of what needs to change. So
Yeah.
we'll,
People get really scared. They came off abruptly. Now they have prolonged withdrawal syndrome, especially the benzos seem to be very, very, very difficult. And they're stuck for years and they're struggling. And they see someone come along. Should I come off abruptly? Should I go up there like, no, no, don't do it. Look what happened to me. I completely understand that. I
right.
completely understand. They wish that they could go back and come off slowly. But I have to say to all those people, there's no guarantee. If you could go back in time and come off slowly, you might still have prolonged withdrawal syndrome.
Right.
That's the
You may
nature
have
of
run into a different issue.
you might run into a different issue. That's absolutely right because of the longer exposure.
Yeah.
Prolonged withdrawal syndrome is very, very individual and very, very confusing. And there's not enough research. And the research that we have says that different people go through. So I think that absolutely go slow is a better because you can tell it feels a little easier. The withdrawal effects aren't as intense or aren't as abrupt. They're more tolerable. That I think is your body telling you that this is a better, safer way. But in terms of predicting the future, predicting the outcome, I think it would be illegitimate and unfair for someone to be able to predict that one way is better than the other.
All right. Well, thanks for that insight, because I know you deal with that much more than I ever
A
had
lot.
to. So
Yeah.
just capturing some of that. And Will, I just want to say thanks for joining me today. And I certainly hope our paths continue to cross as I get more
Absolutely.
involved, because I know you've been involved for a while. And yeah, I just really appreciate your time. So thanks so much.
Fabulous, Penny. Thank you so much. And good luck in all the work that you're doing. It's
right,
really
thank
great to hear
you.
about it. So, all right. Okay. Take care. Yeah. Bye-bye.